Moving right along, this is part 2, talking about what was going on at China's periphery, all the different places. Let's go on to slide 14. So, the Chinese communists had all these spy fears. They were running all these campaigns to catch nasty people. They certainly overestimated how effective outside interests from Taiwan and America and perhaps Britain were, but they weren't paranoid because these sorts of efforts were really going on. There were numerous KMT remnants inside of China, but the thing about them was that the KMT was not running them. As the KMT was defeated on the battlefield, that was pretty much it. Once organized KMT army forces were driven out of China, there really wasn't anything left that was in any coordinated way working for Chiang Kai-shek. The communists thought that they were, and the propaganda that was regularly given to the population directly said that there are spies in your community. They're using radios to communicate back to Taiwan, where there are nasty people who are urging them to kill all the pigs and poison the water and stuff like that, as well as steal secrets. But in spite of their claims to the contrary, the KMT was not running much of anything on the mainland. And when the Americans figured that out, then they decided to run their own efforts. One of them was detailed in this book by the late Frank Holliver. He talks in this book about running operations from the two nationalist-held islands of Quemoy and Matsu, or Jinmen and Matsu, and of approaching people on the high seas to be coast watchers, people who were out fishing, giving them money, offering them food in exchange for spying for the Americans. And they did grab a few people like that. But overall, it really didn't amount to much. It turned out to be a lot of money wasted, really. In Tibet, there were various contacts in the early 1950s. By 1956, this turned into a formal CIA operation to run guerrilla units in China. That is in Tibet. But you know, these operations were meant to harass the government, not to overthrow it. They were pinpricks, really. They didn't really amount to much. There were efforts, and they did get people killed, but they didn't really accomplish much of anything except to piss off the Chinese and and to poison relations between the two sides. However, that's what the Cold War was all about during this period, so it wasn't entirely illogical. The thing about it, though, that I think should be appreciated from a historical perspective is that whenever a big power or a medium power does this sort of thing, they don't always mean to follow through and actually remain loyal friends to the people who are on their side. This problem occurred in Hungary. People in Czechoslovakia 10 years later in 1968 who revolted against the Soviets were hoping for NATO to intervene. But that wasn't going to happen. It would have caused a nuclear war. And the hopes by the Tibetans that the Americans would follow through and liberate Tibet turned out, of course, to be completely false. Going on to slide 15, just a very quick review. If you took the East Asia course, you've seen this slide before. The Soviets in Asia during this period and into the early 1970s were out, until 1960 anyway, were out to protect China, to recover their influence in Manchuria, win the Korean War, this sort of thing, and to break the U.S. encirclement strategies. So they were, in other words, they were helping China to survive and thrive so that they would not be encircled by the containment strategy that the Americans were following at the time. If we go on to the next slide, slide 16, the U.S. objectives in Asia were counter to that, of course. They were to contain the Soviet Union and as China turned communist, contain them, to protect Japan and Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines and Southeast Asia as well, to foster this SEATO alliance, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and foster not only military buildup by the countries along China's periphery, but also to improve their economies and trade freely with the United States, so that their societies would remain strong. And this sort of thing became particularly, on the trade end and the economic end, became particularly successful after about 1965 in the countries that later became known as the little dragons or the tigers of East Asia. That is South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and that economic activity, of course, spread throughout Asia. And a lot of it was intended to contain China. So this is what the Chinese were looking at. Going on to slide 17, and we'll talk about a part of this toward the end. The process that was going on throughout Asia at this time, that the U.S. strategy was also designed to work with, handle, maybe not oppose, was the decolonization of East Asia in these countries along China's periphery. I won't spend any more time on this, but I wanted to note that this was going on because this was an important element in the calculations of China's national leaders as they considered their own foreign policy. Going on to slide 18, when the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek arrived in Taiwan, they knew they were going to be staying there as of, at the latest, January of 1949. But as I think I mentioned previously, Chiang Kai-shek played a game with the communists, resigning briefly, moving around different parts of China, not making it very clear precisely what he was going to do. But when the nationalists came to Taiwan, they came in a brutal fashion. They were not particularly friendly, and one reason was that Taiwan had been had been occupied in a less brutal way by the Japanese, and there was good feeling amongst many people on Taiwan for the Japanese, and not very good feeling about the nationalists. And this brings up an interesting divide that still exists today on Taiwan between people who all speak some dialect of Chinese. The divide between the mainlanders, the people who came to Taiwan or whose ancestors came to Taiwan after World War II, and people who refer to themselves as Taiwanese, who are Chinese ethnically. You can't tell the difference by looking at them, but their ancestors came to China before the end of World War II, usually long before, generations before, and their mother tongue tends to be Taiwanese, which is very similar to Fujian, Fujianese, Fujian being the province straight across there on the mainland. So there was a great divide that was economic and political between these two groups of people, and the divide still exists to some extent today amongst people who prefer Taiwan independence from China in a formal sense. You'll find a great number of them are Taiwanese that I just described, and people who do not are so-called mainlanders. When the KMT first arrived on Taiwan, of course, as we discussed previously, inflation was raging on the mainland, and one of the first things they did was create a new currency, and they pegged it to gold. And so this was a very smart economic move. It resulted in immediate currency stability. However, everything wasn't all strawberries, cherries, and roses. All those are red, aren't they? Anyway, it wasn't a bowl of cherries for the nationalists, because at this time the Americans were sending very clear messages that the U.S. did not intend to assist Taiwan if it was attacked. And so the KMT government was making itself ready to defend Taiwan by itself. Going on to slide 19, however, things changed before long. The first thing that happened was that, we'll discuss it in the next slide, was that the Korean War started, and that changed the whole picture. But for the longer term here that we're speaking of, 1949 to 55, a defensive military assistance agreement was immediately put into effect. The 7th Fleet, the U.S. 7th Fleet, took position in the Taiwan Straits. This was in the days before China had missiles, and protected Taiwan from invasion. The U.S. began as I mentioned a moment ago, an offensive spying campaign against the mainland that at first involved dropping people in and so on, and that became disastrous. As a matter of fact, a couple of Americans were, more than a couple Americans, were shot down over the mainland. There was a particular scandal involving the downing of an aircraft with 2 CIA people on it, Hugh Redmond and something Downey, I think. They were shot down over Liaoning province up in the north, and their imprisonment was a long and bitter one. But anyway, these efforts proved to be disastrous, and so after about 10 years, the U.S. turned toward technology to try to accomplish these ends of figuring out what was going on the mainland, particularly when their nuclear program got going. Going on to slide 20. So on the way to all of this, there was a little bit of independent political maneuvering by one Douglas Macarthur, very famous man. He was appointed by Truman to take charge in Korea and defend the South from the attack from the North. And right after he arrived, he must have been pretty busy, but he still found time to fly down to Taiwan and assess the needs, the defense needs of the nationalist regime. He did not tell the White House that he was going to do this, and when the White House found out that he had done this, they were not particularly happy. But MacArthur was a relatively untouchable figure at this time. He was revered in the country for his role during World War II in taking charge of the U.S. forces in the Pacific and in governing Japan after the war was over with. He was a very astute political figure who wanted to be president of the United States, and he didn't like Harry Truman one bit, and Harry Truman didn't like him one bit. Quite a bit's been written about all that. So it seems, looking at this situation, that MacArthur probably wanted to embarrass and manipulate the Truman administration by making this trip to Taiwan. And it worked out very well for Chiang Kai-shek because MacArthur was no dummy. He could see how the political situation was changing with the Korean War, and this resulted in a closer relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. All of a sudden, those threats of not supporting him if the communists were to invade went out the window, and supporting Taiwan against China became a U.S. priority. Going on to slide 21. So I don't intend to spend too much time on the Korean War, going through it battle by battle or anything like that, but you may be somewhat familiar with that conflict, and I'll try to find a video that gives a summary of it. But the long and the short of it is that when the North Koreans invaded in June of 1950, it was a rollover. The South did not have anti-tank weapons to oppose the armored advance. Their army was smaller. They did not have artillery in any numbers. And it was the same old thing, I hate to keep saying it, but fire and maneuver, once again, became the deciding factor. The U.S. shipped troops over from Japan to help the South Koreans resist this invasion, but they were not well equipped, either physically, mentally, or with the right kind of weaponry. They were garrison troops. They were people who had been living in Japan as an occupying force, enjoying all of the pleasures that an occupying force enjoys. They were getting 3 meals a day. They were sleeping inside of 4 walls under a roof. They did not go out into the field to do field exercises and play infantry. They went to the firing range a minimum number of times per year, and that was it. They tended to work in offices or doing police garrison type work. This is what they were doing, and so this attack suddenly thrust these people who had pretty much minimal military experience, because these did not include too many people who were veterans of the Second World War. It thrust them into a horrible battle situation really fast. And they did not respond well. It wasn't until other reserves began arriving, including reserve units full of World War II veterans, that the situation became reversed, principally by the landing of the famous landing at Incheon 3 months later, that resulted in the rout of the North Korean forces and the push northwards. You can see those arrows there in North Korea, the push northwards that actually brought U.S. troops close to the banks of the Yalu River, where it became de rigueur. It became fashionable to piss into the Yalu. I pissed in the Yalu Club. However, this came at a very bad time. It was October. It was on the eve of the awful North Korean winter, and Chinese forces were massed on the other side of the border, and the Marines, who were at the forefront of the UN advance, were not equipped for winter. That stuff was all in the pipeline and was on its way, but it wasn't there yet. They didn't have heavy coats. They didn't have the right kind of boots. They didn't have white coveralls for fighting in the snow, and so on. They didn't have the right kind of equipment to take artillery through the snow, etc., etc. So that conflict, after 2.5 years, ended up with a truce 2 years actually, ended up with a truce in July of 1953. That line there you see is not the 38th parallel, by the way. 38th parallel went straight across the peninsula, more or less in the same position from east to west, of course, because it was a parallel. This truce line you see was based on the positions of the forces at the time of the truce, and I won't bother reading the awful statistics there of all the people who died because I find it depressing. And you have papers to write. Let's keep going. Slide 22. So the Chinese intervention, the political end of this and the historical end that's interesting is that the rest of the Politburo did not want to go. There was an expanded meeting of the Politburo to include all of its members, during which arguments were made, and almost everyone did not want to intervene on the side of the North Koreans so soon after the end of the Liberation War. But Mao was the exception. Mao saw several things. One was solidarity with a fellow socialist government. Another was China's pride, not wanting to have the Americans pissing in the Yalu. But a third was the geopolitical aspect, which we've discussed previously, and that is nobody in their right mind who's in charge of China wants a hostile power controlling all of the Korean peninsula, because if that happens, then that means that you have a strategic threat on your doorstep. Instead, through the ages, Chinese thinkers have wanted to have a buffer state in Korea, either the whole peninsula or part of it. The Americans were willing to continue the fight against these large numbers of Chinese troops, and this is where fire and maneuver again was a decisive element, but it was more evenly matched. The Americans did not quite control the air as they were used to doing, and as in subsequent conflicts they became used to doing, because there were Russians who were flying make fighter jets, as well as Chinese flying those jets, who opposed them. The U.S. jets were faster in general and had better armament in general, but they were fairly closely matched, and the Russian pilots, of course, were very experienced. This was the beginning of the jet age, of course, where the pilots on both sides were getting their first combat experience behind the wheel of a jet aircraft that could go very, very fast. The Americans considered using atomic weapons, and indeed Macarthur wanted to use atomic weapons against the Chinese, but the deliberations inside the Truman administration went the other way, and the Americans shared this information with the British, who were very interested in that outcome of that debate, because after all they had to worry about Hong Kong. If nuclear weapons were dropped on Chinese forces up north, then perhaps something bad might happen down south. And unfortunately for the British and the Americans, there was a Soviet network in just the right place to report that to Moscow, and of course the Chinese found that out too, so they knew that the Americans would not use nuclear weapons. Going on to slide 23 to wind up the whole thing with the Korean War. The negotiations that went on between the two sides, there's our friend Lee Kun-ong again, went on for a long time. The big issue was prisoner exchange, because there were a few Americans who wanted to stay in China, just a few. There were an awful lot of Chinese who did not want to go back to China, and Mao did not want to give any ground on this, and this became the sticking point that held up the negotiations and the end of the war. But there was another sticking point, and that was Joseph Stalin himself. Stalin thought that keeping the war going would be good for the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. Exactly why he thought that, I'm not sure, but I think it's probably because Americans were dying and Russians weren't, to boil it down to its basic point. So once Stalin died in 1953, April, I believe it was, then the way became clear to redefine the goalposts, so to speak, and the Chinese side was able, excuse me, to have more leverage and negotiate a truce. That's where they came up with this whole demilitarized zone, which is 2 kilometers wide and goes from one end of the peninsula to the other, with a military demarcation line in between. It's not really very demilitarized. Both sides were able to continue light infantry patrols. They couldn't bring 50 caliber machine guns in. They could bring 38 caliber machine guns in. I won't bore you any further. Going on to slide 24. So this uneasy truce was pretty much the same sort of thing that developed between China and Taiwan. Between the Koreas, you had what amounted to a zone that neither side entered in great force, and that was the Taiwan Straits between China and Taiwan. You had an understanding that we won't be shooting at each other because there's no point. We want to try to maintain peace and build up our societies. We might pinprick each other once in a while, but it's not going to go very far. We'll certainly conduct lots of propaganda, and we'll do a spy Cold War sort of thing between the Koreas, but we're not going to attack each other. And the same sort of thing developed between China and Taiwan as well. There were instances of shooting between the two sides, but they were relatively insignificant. The Russians and the U.S. backed each of these sides, respectively, in ways that I think we've already made pretty clear. And an uneasy status quo lasted until 1972 between China and Taiwan, when it was unbalanced by the U.S. decision to de facto recognize China and bring China into the struggle against the Soviet Union on America's side, or vice versa, America on China's side. You could talk about that one all day. In Korea, that uneasy truce with occasional problems is still in place without very much difference. Going on to slide 25. Now we're going to go back a little bit. I think I'll stop here and we'll continue with slide 25 in the next recording.